Hey, this is Miss Coffee. I thought I'd try reading a book to you and see how it goes. I don't know if you'll like it or not, but here we're going to try. The book is called Trapped in Death Cave, and it's by Bill Wallace, who was a fourth grade teacher in Chickasha, Oklahoma, and then he became a principal, and they even built a school and named it after him. It's a really good book. Okay, Chapter 1. Brian stuck his little fingers against the corners of his mouth and whistled as loud as he could. He listened. There was no answer but the rustling of the Oklahoma wind through the pear tree by the cabin. So he tried it again. This time his whistle was so loud and piercing it made his eyes scrunch up. Still nothing. No one appeared at the door of the big house across from his cabin. No whistle came back to his ears from the rough, rocky slopes of the hills. Finally, he shrugged and walked back down the steps. Mama met him right near the bottom. "Must be out playing football," she said, peeking over the big box of bed sheets in her arms. "Must be," Brian agreed. Dad was digging stuff out of the car trunk. For a second, it reminded Brian of somebody getting eaten by a shark. The way the trunk lid gaped open like a big jaw, and the way Dad was stuck inside with only his bottom sticking up and his legs dangling out. Dad finally got the ice chest he was fighting with. He made a kind of grunting sound as he wrestled it out of the trunk and got his feet on the ground again. "Gary coming?" Brian shrugged. "Must be off playing football or something. I whistled, but..." Dad made another one of those grunting sounds when he picked the big ice chest up in his arms. "Grab those 2 sacks of groceries." He jerked his head at the sacks on the ground. "You help us put stuff away. Maybe Gary'll be home by then." Brian grabbed the sacks and followed Dad up the steps. When they got to the top, Mama was there to open the door. Brian paused for just a moment. There was still no sign of Gary. Since Brian had met Gary Marlar, they'd been the best of friends. The one thing Brian always did when he and his family arrived at their cabin in Medicine Park was whistle so Gary would know they were there. They stayed together from the first minute Brian arrived until he got in the car for the long drive back home to Chickasha. "Come on, Brian." Mama's voice brought his eyes away from Gary's house and hurried him into the cabin. It looked just the same as they had left it last summer. There was a lot more dust, but as soon as Brian and Dad finished dragging stuff up from the car, Mama would take care of the dusting and cleaning and all the other things that needed doing. The front porch was screened in with thick plastic shutters that were closed to keep the rain and cold out. From the door, the porch went clear across the front of the cabin and around one side. That's where the beds were. Brian followed Mama through the door on the right where the kitchen and living room were. He put the sacks down next to the ice chest. "I can't figure it out," Brian complained. "Gary knew we were coming down. He's always here when he knows we're coming. He wouldn't be out playing football when he knew we were going to be here this afternoon." Dad came in from the back part of the cabin, back where the bathroom and the fuse box, where the electricity were. He put a hand on Brian's shoulder. He might have had to go to his grandfather's house. The funeral was 2 weeks ago. He might be up there helping his mom and dad put his belongings together. Dad shrugged. "You know, stuff like that has to be done." Brian looked up at his dad. There was a kind of heavy feeling in his chest. "Easter vacation's going to be different this year, isn't it, Dad?" Dad nodded. "You and Gary spent a lot of time with his grandpa, and you're right, it is going to be different, a lot different without him." Dad's throat bulged out when he swallowed. "You and Gary will be all right, though. You're best friends. Now he's probably going to still be feeling sad. You're just going to have to be patient and understanding with him." Brian tried to smile. "I'm still feeling kind of sad, too." Dad put a hand on top of Brian's head and ruffled his hair. "I know. Come on, we got a couple more loads to carry up from the car." By the time they had finished carrying stuff up from the car, Mama was already busy dusting. She had opened the plastic shutters on the porch to let things air out. Dad got the vacuum sweeper and started to work on the carpet. Brian went back to the front door. "I'm going to walk up to Grandpa's and see if I can find Gary," he called. Nobody heard him. He waved his arms a couple of times. Finally, Dad looked up from his sweeping. Brian motioned to the door. Dad nodded, saying it was okay. Brian stopped on the top step for a moment. Coming to Medicine Park was like coming to a different world. Back home in Chickasha, the land was flat and smooth. There was nothing but rolling hills and a few trees to break up the Oklahoma prairie. But here at the edge of the Wichita Mountains, only 50 miles from home, it was altogether different. Medicine Park was in a small valley, nestled between the high mountains all around. The houses were built out of round granite rocks, called cobblestones. They were perched against the side of the hills, all facing the river that flowed through the middle of the valley. It really wasn't a river. It was called It was called Medicine Creek. It wasn't like most of the other rivers Brian had seen in Oklahoma. It wasn't red and muddy looking. Medicine Creek was a blue color, so clear you could see clean to the bottom in most places. You had to hunt to find dirt, too, and when you did find dirt, it wasn't red dirt like around home. Here it was brown and sandy, washed down from the stone and granite boulders that sprung up from everywhere against the sides of the Wichitas. It was a beautiful place, wild and rugged. There were areas so hard to get to that no more than a mile away from the cabin, Brian bet he and Gary could find places no one had ever explored before. "Hey, Brian." "Oh, Brian. Hey, Brian." Brian blinked. The whispered sound of his name snapped him out of his daydreams. He looked around. "Brian!" The shushed whisper came again. "Brian, down here!" He looked toward the bottom of the steps. There on the ground he spotted the toe of a grungy old tennis shoe. It was so dirty it was almost brown. The rest of the shoe was hidden behind the pear tree in front of the house. Brian jumped down the steps. Sure enough, Gary was attached to the other end of the shoe. "Hey, Gary, what are you doing sneaking around and hiding behind that old tree?" Gary put a finger to his lips, shushed him. "I got something to show you, but we can't let nobody else know. Come on." Brian followed his friend. They moved silently along the wall in front of the cabin. Gary crouched down and went beside the honeysuckle hedge between Brian's cabin and the house to the west. They cut through the backyard of that house, then followed the thick cover of oak trees around the ridge and went back down toward the schoolhouse. At the edge of the road, Gary crouched down and looked to make sure there were no cars. Brian squatted beside him, tapping him on the shoulder. "I'm awful sorry about Grandpa's accident." Gary's eyes were tight when he looked up. His jaw stuck way out, almost mean and determined looking. "It was no fishing accident like everybody thinks," Gary almost growled instead of whispering. Brian frowned. "Huh?" "Somebody killed him. I don't know who yet, but I know somebody murdered my grandpa. Come on, I'll show you." That's the end of chapter 1.